holding companies and guarantees when good structures go bad. Welcome to IO Insolvency Options with Darren Vardy, the Managing Director of Insolvency Options and a registered liquidator with over 30 years of experience helping businesses and individuals navigate financial challenges. In today's episode, Darren reveals how good businesses can fail for boring reasons, sharing a shocking case study of a holding company that collapsed due to a single lease guarantee. He explains how one property dispute brought down 3 profitable subsidiaries, costing the owners their entire business empire. You'll learn about the dangers of holding company guarantees, alternatives like increased security bonds, and why shareholder agreements are essential prenups for business partnerships. I'm your co-host Anthony Pearl. Let's dive into unlocking more about insolvency options. Darren, I want to turn our attention to a whole idea around businesses that go bad for, boring reasons. And there's a tangled web that can happen with holding companies and you and I had a bit of a discussion about this before we started recording. I think this is a fascinating tale because holding companies is something that people are familiar with and think it's all very straightforward, but it's pretty easy for that to go astray.
Yes, it is. Quite often, those who get proper advice will put an appropriate structure in place for the type of business that they're going to invest in and get themselves involved in. And it's easy for a business owner to make a simple mistake and inadvertently expose a holding company for debts directly of their subsidiaries. We had a situation just recently where there was a retailer who had a number of different venues or shops, and with the different shops being in different geographical locations, they'd set up those shops as independent subsidiaries, all with different suppliers in those local geographical areas. So they had the holding company, which was running the management and oversight of all the businesses, but the shops were their own independent operating entities. Now, structurally, that's good because if one shop fails, generally it doesn't have an impact on the holding company or the other individual entities operating. In this instance, however, we had a situation where the landlord of one of the operating entities required a guarantee of the holding company, for which the holding company actually provided that guarantee. Now, as a result of that holding company providing the guarantee, the holding company was then exposed to the entirety of the lease of that particular venue, of that one shop. Now, as it happened, a lease dispute in respect to that shop was incurred. There were issues with the premises, litigation, and some very expensive litigation ensued, all of which exposed the holding company because the holding company was a guarantor on the lease. The outcome of the litigation was that, pursuant to the lease, an amount needed to be paid. Couldn't be paid by the operating entity, but at that time was no longer operating within the premises because of the property issues that they faced. And therefore, the landlord turned to the holding company to pay the debt. Now, the holding company didn't have the ability or the funds to pay the debt. And as a result of saying, it was pursued through the courts to get a judgment and then pursued into winding up, which a creditor can look to wind up a company for a debt that's outstanding. As a result of that then brought down the other 3 operating entities that were operating profitably, but because they were subsidiaries or the shares held by the holding company in those entities, that then brought the whole structure undone. And the business in its entirety was exposed by virtue of the holding company having provided that guarantee. And what resulted from that is those 3 other businesses having to actually be sold as a going concern to then deal with and pay out all the creditors in those entities. Any surplus that existed went up the chain as a return to the shareholder, the holding company. And then the liquidator of the holding company then was to use that money to then repay its creditors, primarily the landlord from that other subsidiary entity.
So let's go back to where this all began. Was the mistake in the guarantee in the first place? Was there another way that they should have gone about it?
Well, generally under leases, you can negotiate whether guarantees are provided or not. Quite often, the way to negotiate out of a guarantee is to provide a greater security bond, for instance. So instead of providing a 1 month, 2 month, 3 month bond, you might provide a 6 month bond, which will satisfy the landlord for their risk as opposed to a guarantee. So they could have maybe negotiated better on entering the lease as opposed to simply agreeing to providing a guarantee, particularly where they got advice and paid good money to set the structure up to protect the individual trading entities from each other.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's a few things here. Is that in the first place, is that a red flag for people if there is an insistence that, no, we're not going to accept a stronger bond, we actually need this guarantee from here? Is that a bit of a red flag for someone who's taking out a lease in the first place?
Absolutely. And the question might be, do we really need to take this property? Are there alternative properties that we can look to secure that doesn't have those stringent requirements and put our business in its entirety at risk?
When you got involved with this particular company, how aware were they that they had made that mistake to put that guarantee in place in the beginning? Was that something that didn't become apparent until issues started arising, or were they fully aware?
It didn't become apparent until they were in the litigation. And when the holding company became the second defendant to that litigation, it was only then that they realised that and went back and looked at the lease to that a guarantee from the holding company had in fact been provided.
So as a result of all of this, where did it leave the other businesses that were then in this chain?
So where it left the owners was that they were without a business because they had no alternative but to then go and sell the other 3 businesses as a going concern, with the funds, with all the creditors being paid of those entities and any surplus funds going back up to the holding company to then repay the debt.
Do those businesses run now as individually as functioning business?
I believe so, yes.
At the end of all of that kind of process, the owners of this, now they don't have a business as a result of all of this, how does it impact them in terms of trying to run a business in the future?
Well, it impacts them in 2 ways. Firstly, any funds that they've put in to set everything up in the first instance is not recoverable by them, given that there was no funds available to flow back. Secondly, they are directors of 2 companies that have gone into liquidation. So ultimately, if they set up a new business and they want to borrow money, that will be a little bit more difficult than normal to borrow money and potentially get trade credit accounts.
I mean, that's an interesting one too, because there are circumstances here that happened that wasn't really about the businesses not running profitably.
Correct.
How much does that get looked into when you are a business owner that finds that this has happened to banks and the like, and looking at running future businesses? Does that get taken into consideration, the circumstances, or is it all just by the book?
Generally, it's all just by the book. There are some lenders who will take into consideration, but generally they're sort of second, third, fourth tier lenders where the price of funds comes at a premium. Unlike your, for want of a better term, big banks who provide the most commercial rates on borrowings.
I mean, this is a difficult situation, isn't it, for business owners like this? They were running good businesses. They were doing the right thing, so they thought, made a small mistake, and it's had a catastrophic impact.
Correct. And, this all started from a lease dispute, which in reading the material, there were genuine issues with the property, water leaks and the like, resulting from some rain events, which adversely impacted the operation of that particular venue and that particular business.
So in this kind of situation, how difficult is it for you when there's a litigation issue to walk in and do what you do? Is that become a significant factor? How much do you look at the fact that they were trading profitably and that there's an opportunity here to come in and do the right thing? Or does it immediately put some red flags that you have to take a step back and have a good look at it before you get involved?
Sure. Look, at immediately, wherever there's litigation, there's an immediate issue of, is there an ability to do a turnaround? And whilst they may have traded at a profit, can they resurrect the business and the trading of that business back to the position that they were in? And litigation complicates any turnarounds, and it really depends on the financial circumstances and the financial wherewithal of the parties to be able to, muster up the necessary working capital to execute a recovery plan. Because without working capital, no recovery is successful.
I guess this whole idea of good businesses going bad is not as uncommon as we might think, because there's lots of reasons that businesses break up.
Correct.
And that can lead to lots of issues because people go in with eyes glowing in terms of, oh, we're going to get on great. You know, I'm sure there's examples of dual business owners and going in with a great relationship and something happens and it goes south and then that becomes a big issue.
Yeah, look, at the end of the day, a lot of businesses get set up and quite often they don't think about the what if scenario. And it's when that what if scenario becomes reality is when it's more difficult to then deal properly and appropriately with the issues at hand.
And what are some of the big red flags that you've seen over the years where these are legitimately good businesses and then something has happened, like this example of the lease, where it's just that people haven't realized that there are red flags here that they should have looked at?
Yeah. Look, one of the typical ones is shareholder agreements, where, as you indicated, people are friends, they're all lovey-dovey when they get into business. But when business is hard, there's no two ways about that. Business is hard. And when these people, these directors, these shareholders are running a business and hit tough times, that's when human nature comes to the forefront. And quite often shareholders' disputes arise because parties don't know how to deal with, or they don't have a framework with dealing with problems. And one of those may simply be the exit of a shareholder. Now, if there's no rules of engagement to deal with the exit of a shareholder or the incoming or a new shareholder and the like, that all adds to frustration and angst amongst the parties. And quite often, good businesses we see can fail as a result of shareholders' disputes.
Yeah, it's a bit like a prenup, isn't it? But for business owners. And I think there's a difference between we won't get into that debate, but you go in always with the best of intentions to these things. And I imagine, again, going back to the lease agreement, you went in with the best of intentions thinking, oh yeah, everything will be sweet. But suddenly when it's not, that's when the challenges arise. And is it just a case of people not getting good advice? What is it that is leading to this?
I think it's a case of not getting advice at all. It's not whether the advice is good or bad. It's not getting advice in the first instance when setting up a business. You refer to a prenup, and that's exactly what it is. A shareholder's dispute is a divorce, right? And if you don't have a prenup or a shareholder's agreement, or rules of engagement as to how to deal with things when a separation is to occur, then there is a lot of time, energy, and emotional energy, because it's almost as highly emotive as a divorce, because the parties have put their blood, sweat, and tears into their business to grow it to a certain level. So when there is a dispute and a separation, it is quite often very like a divorce from an emotional point of view, where there's a shareholders agreement, a prenup, as you say, rules of engagement as to how to deal with it. That can take the emotion away from the situation and de-escalate the situation, because there is a process to follow that everyone has agreed on from the outset.
I mean, you've spoken about it before, I mean, the whole what if scenario that people need to examine, don't they? It's different. The emotion attached to an actual marriage is a little bit different, and no one wants to go in thinking that that's going to be anything other than for life. But when it's business, it very rarely is a for life decision. There's always reasons why things break up, and they can be legitimate reasons. Someone gets sick, someone decides to move to another country. There's any number of reasons that can happen that can separate things out that's completely different to that sort of marriage scenario. Is it common that people actually get the proper advice beforehand, or do you see it more often than not that this is happening?
Certainly in small business land, advice is not sought when people come together to go into business. And whilst they may rely upon the Corporations Act standard constitution, the replaceable rules, there's more to that needs to be considered. As I say, the what if, the worst case scenario needs to be considered, and a term set out as to how you deal with that if it actually eventuates.
Yeah, it's a challenging one. I mean, what are the lessons that you would give to small business owners who are finding, I mean, there's one thing to get the advice in the first place, but if they're starting to find that there is an issue here, are there steps that they can take before it escalates to the point where you get involved?
Oh, look, absolutely. Absolutely. And the step to take is engage early with your advisors. Get the advice as to what your position is. so you know legally what your position is, and then negotiate a solution. And it's always cheaper to negotiate a solution than it is to end up with protracted, expensive litigation over something that may or may not commercially be worthwhile.
Just to wrap this up, I mean, how difficult it is for you walking into a business where you have two parties or more that are in dispute with one another, because you're coming over and above and just looking at the business as a whole, but dealing with that extra layer of disputes within owners, that's a huge challenge.
Well, generally in those situations where the dispute is escalated and no agreement can in fact be made, my involvement is generally being appointed by the court as a liquidator or a receiver, following an application being made by one of the parties, one of the warring parties, to have me appointed on a what's called a just and equitable basis. And then obviously once I'm appointed, while I have to give some regard to the directors and shareholders, my appointment is generally governed by either the Corporations Act or the appointment document, whatever the court determines my role is going to be, which generally is realise the assets, pay the creditors, and if there's any surplus left at the end, divide that up amongst the shareholders. So to negotiate an outcome where one of the parties continues on with the business and that business continues to trade into the future is a far better situation, even though neither party's going to be happy with that outcome and they're going to expect that the other party's taken advantage. But it is a far better outcome than the alternative, which is a liquidator being appointed, the business ceasing the trade, assets realised, and you get back whatever's left at the end of the day.
And that's all we have time for in this episode. But next time on IO Insolvency Options, we'll explore the critical difference between optimism and realism in business. Darren will share insights on why hope can be the enemy of good decision making and reveal how early engagement with advisors can transform outcomes. It's an essential listening for every business owner facing challenges. For details on how to get in touch with Darren and his team on insolvency challenges, please consult the show notes. This podcast is produced by my team at podcastdoneforyou.com.au, helping professionals share their expertise through powerful podcast content. If you found value in today's episode, please like, comment, and subscribe to IO Insolvency Options. Until next time, remember, there's always a way forward when you know your options.